very glad to be here. Let me put this beautiful book on the table. This is my first time in Taiwan, and I'm very glad that I have this opportunity to visit Taiwan. I was in China until this morning and in the past few days, and I'm very, very glad to be in Taiwan to present this work. I'm very grateful to UDN for hosting this forum. I'm very grateful to my publisher in Taiwan, Acropolis, for publishing my book in Taiwan. I was told that the translation is very beautiful, although I am not able to say. This book was written for a broad international audience, and of course, I was very glad with the success of the book in America and in Europe. But I care about the debate in Asia, in China, in Taiwan. I was in Korea in September when the book was published. I will be in Japan in December, and I'm very, very glad that this book is attracting interest in Taiwan as well. So this is probably first I should apologize that as you can see my English sounds a lot like French. So for those of you who know French, this might be good, but for the others, I'm sorry about that. I should also apologize that my book maybe is a little bit too long. On the other hand, the reason it's a long book is because it includes a lot of historical material on a large number of countries. So let me, in this presentation, so this will be based on my book. I will not be able to present everything, but first of all, I should say that this book is trying to study the global dynamics of income and wealth distribution since the 18th century in over 20 countries. And this really comes from an historical data collection project, and this has been a very collective project, and there is no way, I could have collected all this historical data on my own. So, of course, income and wealth distribution has been a subject of inquiry among economists for a very long time. So, in the 19th century, many economists, including Ricardo and Marx, were very much interested in the evolution of the distribution and the long-run evolution of the distribution. One problem is that they had very little data, so it's more difficult to talk about a topic when you don't have data. So this was mostly theoretical approaches. Then in the 20th century, a number of economists, in particular Simon Kuznets, started to develop more empirical and historical approach to income distribution. And in particular, Kuznets, Kuznets was an American economist who was the first economist to compute GDP for America in the interwar period. The GDP statistics that we have today, which seems natural to everybody, initially this did not exist, and this was created in the case of the US by Kuznets. And then his next task was to use the income tax data. So the income tax had been created in 1913 in the US, and so in the 1950s, he used the income tax data from 1913 to 1948 to compute the evolution of the share of national income going to the different income groups, and in particular to the top 10%, the bottom 90%. So, his first task was to compute national accounts, national income, and the next task was to compute the series on the distribution. So this was only on one country over a 35-year period, but this was the first time that there was an historical series on income distribution. And in the 19th century, people were talking about this distribution, but with no data. So Kuznets in the 1950s had a series, and he found a very good and optimistic news, which was a reduction, a very large reduction, which I'm going to show you in a minute, of income inequality in the United States between 1910 and 1950, well, 1930 and 1948. And this gave rise to the idea of the Kuznets curve in the 1950s, 1960s. And the view was that at some advanced stages of development, income inequality would decline, will naturally decline. So to be honest, Kuznets, if you read the book of Kuznets, he was not that optimistic, and he was very much aware that in the case of the US, this reduction of inequality had a lot to do with the war policies, the compression of the distribution of wages in the US during World War II, the Great Depression induced large shocks to capital and owners of businesses, progressive taxation became very high in the US in the interwar period and during World War II, even more progressive. And Kuznets was very much aware that all these factors played a role. But in the 50s, 60s, probably partly because of the Cold War context, people, at least in the West, wanted to have optimistic conclusion about the long-run evolution of inequality in capitalist systems. So there was this very optimistic belief in the Kuznets curve that it was a natural process that you will have decline in inequality. So all what we've done in this research, in a way, is to follow the Kuznets approach, except that we have extended this kind of approach to many more countries and many more years. Okay? And this is, I could not have done that without many co-authors. So Atkinson was already a sort of early follower of Kuznets, and in the 1970s worked a lot on the evolution of wealth distribution in Britain. And so 15 years ago, I started doing this work for a number of countries, in particular looking at the evolution of income and wealth distribution in the long run for France. And Atkinson extended it to Britain. With Emmanuel Saez, we did it for the United States. With Facundo Alvaredo, we did it for Argentina and Spain. With Abhijit Banerjee for India. And it became a very collective project. And so this, I'm going to present some of the results that we found. And as you will see, the fact that we now have more data, more countries, of course, changes quite a lot the perspective of Kuznets in 1950s, 1960s. And, at the end of the day, I think I think there are many different forces going in different directions. I think in a way both Marx and Kuznets were wrong. Marx believes that there will be a natural rise in inequality forever. Kuznets that there will be a natural decline in inequality, or at least this was the Kuznets curve interpretation. I'm not sure Kuznets really believed in the Kuznets curve, but this was the interpretation. I believe that there is no, I do not believe in economic deterministic laws. I think it very much depends on the institutions and the policies that we choose. There are different forces that can either reduce inequality, like the diffusion of skills, education, knowledge, but there are also forces that can increase inequality, and it really depends on the institution and policies that we choose. And ultimately, this book is really just trying to contribute to a more informed democratic discussion about this, because ultimately this will all depend on what our democratic institutions decide in terms of policy to keep inequality under control and to make sure that market forces work in the benefit of all. So, there is a part 4 in the book where I try to draw conclusion for the future and what kind of policy, education, progressive taxation and other policies. But, let me say very clearly that I am much better at analyzing the past than the future, and that, I don't ask you to agree with all of my conclusion. I think whatever your political persuasion and whatever your own conclusion about different types of policy, I think the book is primarily an historical narrative, and I think whatever your political persuasion, you will find the historical narrative and the historical material that's really the core of the book of some interest. So in this presentation, I will present some results from the book to give you a sense of the kind of material I cover in the book. But if you really want to have a better sense of the material, well, first, please read the book. But if you don't want to read the book, have a look at this website where I put all the statistical series and all the tables and graphs online. So, by going through the list of graphs and tables, you will have a good sense of the material that's in the book, and maybe you will want to read the book after, or maybe you won't, but in any case, you will have a good sense of what's in the book. So let me start by saying that a big part of the data on income that I present in the book comes from the World Top Income Database. So this is also a website which you can access very easily. So the countries in red are already in the database, and the countries in blue are about to enter the database. So what it means to be in the database is that we try to use all the historical data on income that we could find, and in particular, usually the oldest source of data on income comes from the income tax itself. So it's important to realize that taxation is always more than taxation. It's also a way to produce information, to produce legal categories, statistical categories. You know, when there was no corporate profit tax, there was no the very notion of profit, and there was sometimes no accounts of companies to really compute their profit. So I'm not saying the accounts of companies are always fully accurate, but at least they exist when you have a corporate tax. Whereas in the 19th century, when you don't have a corporate tax, you don't have the accounts. And when you have an inheritance tax, this goes with the registration of property, and that's useful for organizing the economy to register property rights. And the income tax, it's also a way to report income, to define income more precisely, and to produce information about income, which is useful, I think, to just regulate our policies and to adapt our policies to the changes we have. So the modern income tax was created in 1913 in the United States, as I said, and in many Western countries it was created around that time. So in France it was created in 1914. In Britain, there was a proportional income tax in the 19th century, but it was made progressive in 1908. In Germany, and actually in Japan also, it was introduced a bit earlier, around 1880, 1890, so we have data starting a bit earlier. In some countries, it was introduced a bit later. In China, there was an income tax that was introduced in the early 1980s. But unfortunately, in China, this is a country with an income tax, but we don't have income tax statistics, which is a problem because it makes it more difficult to study income distribution, and I will talk more about that later. In Taiwan, from my understanding, is that the income tax was introduced in the 1960s, and I apologize that Taiwan was not included in the book, but because I didn't have a study at the time the book was written. But recently, of course, a lot of important work of income and income distribution in Taiwan has been done for a long time by economists in Taiwan, and in particular, recently there was a study by Cyrus Chu, who I believe is in the room somewhere, and who used the historical income tax data in Taiwan, but I just received the study, I guess, a few days ago, so I could not include it in this presentation and in the book, of course, which was published 1 year and a half ago. But I will refer to this in a minute. I think it's important to insist that we keep extending the database all the time, and in particular, the publication of the book has made it easier in some countries to access the fiscal data. And so, for instance, Brazil and Mexico will soon be included, and Korea also is not on this map, but we now have a very interesting study on the evolution of top income shares in Korea starting in the 1930s until today. So, this is extending. So let me show you an example of the kind of graph that we get from this database, taking the example of the United States. Okay, so this is the share of total income going to the top 10% of the distribution. And so the decline in the 1930s, 1940s was what Kuznets found. Okay, so you can see the decline, the share of total income going to the top 10% was almost 50% in 1928. Then it goes down to below 35% during World War II, and it stabilizes between 30 and 35%, a bit below, so about 1/3 of total income for the top 10%, if you want, in the 50s, 60s, 70s. So this is the time Kuznets writes in the 50s, and this is exactly what Kuznets found. Kuznets didn't have Excel, but he did the computation right, and we agree, there's no disagreement with Kuznets. And all what we've done is that we've added many more years of data and many more countries. So we have over 20 countries and close now to 30 countries. And as you can see, having more years of data changes the perspective that you can have on the evolution. Because, so in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the share going to the top 10% was sort of stable, almost completely stable. About 1/3 of total income will go to the top 10, which means that everybody was benefiting from growth in the same proportion. Okay, if you have a stable share for the top 10%, it means that if you have a GDP growth rate of 3%, everybody grows at 3%. The average income of the top 10 grows at 3%. The average income of the bottom 90 grows at 3%. So, this is sort of the ideal balanced growth path of the post-war period. And indeed, this is what was happening. Now, the problem is that starting around 1980, as you can see, you have a very big increase in the share going to the top 10%, which goes from about 1/3 to almost 1/2. And in fact, if you go, I'm sorry that I did not update this graph, but if you go to the website, you will see the data until 2012, and we are going to put 2013 online in a few weeks, and you will see that it is now even above 50%. It is around 51, 52% in 2012 for the top 10%. So the rise seems to be continuing, and in particular, you can see the financial crisis and the stock market cycle. Of course, this has strong effect on very top income shares, because top incomes have a lot of capital gains, stock options, bonuses, and so you can see in 2001, 2002, during the stock market crisis, and again in 2008, 2009, this goes down, because it's not a good time in a stock market crash to make a big capital gain and to get a big bonus. But then after the crash, when the economy recovers, the trend keeps going up. And so it would be a mistake to believe that, financial crises by themselves will change the trend. And the evidence we have is that in 2012, we are already above the 2007 high point, which was itself a little bit above the previous high point of 1928. So, the trend seems to be continuing. So, a number of remarks about this graph, I think, are important. First of all, these are pretty big evolution. When you go from 1/3 to 1/2 of total primary national income going to the top 10%, this is a very large change. This is not just a matter of a few individuals getting very rich, which after all, if it's just a few individuals for the benefit of the entire economy, why not? But, when you go from 1/3 to 1/2, this has macroeconomic significance. And this means that, for instance, over this time period, between 1980 and 2010, you have, over 2/3 of aggregate US economic growth was taken by the top 10%, and most of it by the top 1%. So if the economic growth had been extremely good, like China, 10% per year, maybe you are ready to give, 2/3 to the top 10, although 2/3 is a lot. But, if the problem is that, of course, the economic growth in the US over this period was not particularly remarkable by historical standards, and the average per capita GDP growth was about 1.5, 1.6%. Per capita growth, total growth was like 2.5, 3, but you have population growth in the US, so the per capita growth was like 1.5, 1.6, 1.7. So if you have 2/3 going to the top, it's not a very good deal for the rest of the population. And I think many people now in the US agree that this has contributed not only to the stagnation of median incomes until 2007, but also to the increase of household debt. And finally, this has probably contributed to fragilize the financial system. And the fact that there was a very high point in 1928, 2007, of course, worried a lot of persons. Although, this is partly a correlation rather than a causality, in the sense that when you have a stock market boom, you have an increase in very top incomes, and you have also probably more fragility in the financial system. That doesn't mean that inequality is causing the crisis. But although I think rising inequality, it's not the only reason for the crisis. Financial systems are sufficiently fragile to crash by themselves, even without an increase in inequality. But I think this contributed probably to make the system more fragile. When you have this big transfer of income, this probably contributed to the rise of household debt when you have stagnation of bottom 50% or even bottom 70% income. So probably this contributed to the crisis. So now the question is, why did it happen? Why was it so high? So let me first say, I'm not going to show you every country from the database, but you can go on the World Top Income database and compare with other countries, or you can look at the book. But if we were to look at Europe or Japan, the rise in the top income shares is less strong. You have an increase in the top income shares, but it is less strong than in the US. The findings that I have seen for Taiwan seem to be that the rise in top income shares was also less strong than in the United States, although probably stronger than in Europe and Japan, like in Korea or Singapore. But I don't want to say too much about this data. This is ongoing work, but so, there is a general evolution, rising top income shares, but with different magnitude in different countries. So it's very large in the US, much less large in Europe and Japan, and maybe intermediate in countries like Britain, Korea, and maybe Taiwan. But we don't have all the data yet. So anyway, if we just take the US and Europe, to simplify, because I don't want to come too much into the discussion and controversy in Taiwan. I know too little to enter too much into that. If we just take Europe and the US and say Japan, why is it that the rise in inequality has been much larger in the US? So it's difficult if you just say, well, that's because of information technology, globalization. That's not enough, because you also have information technologies in Japan or in Europe and globalization as well. So, that's not completely enough. You need to have more than that. So what will be the explanation? Probably the one explanation, so the very standard economic explanation for changes in inequality will be changes in the supply and demand of skills. And maybe due to globalization, you have more demand for high-skilled labor. And so here the explanation will be that in the US, the supply of skills maybe was even more, did not grow sufficiently fast, in particular for the bottom groups of the population. So the problem is maybe the inequality of skills, acquisition of skills and access to good education in the US. Maybe the inequality was larger than in Europe and in Japan, and that will be part of the explanation for why you have a higher rise of inequality in the US. So yes, that will be the standard explanation based on education and skill premium, and many labor economists in the US, Larry Katz and many other people favor this explanation, and I think there's a lot to that, which is that in the US, you have very good top universities, of course, we all know that, but the bottom half of the population doesn't go to Harvard, and sometimes the high school and the community college to which they go to, is not so good. And so the inequality in acquisition of skill education, maybe is particularly strong in the US. And indeed, if you look at the bottom half of the population, the proportion going to college almost did not increase at all over this period. Whereas for the top groups, everybody is going to college, but you take the bottom half, it's the expansion in educational achievement, which was very high in the 50s, 60s, 70s, sort of was not as high. So there was still, of course, a rise in proportion going to college, but as compared to the rising demand for skills, maybe there was insufficient supply of education. So then the policy solution will be, of course, more investment in education. And, I think it's part of the explanation. I think, one of the general conclusion from my book is that the diffusion of skills and education and knowledge, is certainly the most important force to reduce inequality in the long run. That can be more important than progressive taxation, more important than R bigger than G. There are many different economic mechanisms that are important in my book because, to explain 3 centuries of data for over 20 countries, it will be meaningless to explain everything with R bigger than G or whatever. You have very different forces that matter, and in particular, the diffusion of education, is absolutely key. This can reduce inequality between countries. A big part of the convergence process that we have in the world, which made it possible for countries like Taiwan and Korea, and now for China to catch up with rich countries, had a lot to do with the diffusion of technical skills and knowledge and high productivity labor. And this can also work within countries. if you have sufficiently inclusive educational institution and social institutions. So, and probably this, the lack of such institutions or, insufficiently inclusive investment in education is part of the explanation. Now, education is important, but that's probably not the entire explanation for this evolution, because a big part of this rise in the top 10% share happened really for the very top incomes, like the top 1%, top 0.5%, and it's not that the education level of this group is a lot higher than the top next 2 or 3% below them. So, increasing supply of education is useful, but probably that's not going to solve the problem of the fact that you have this huge increase at the very, very top. So here, I think the explanation is more that the way top managerial compensation is fixed in the US and actually in a number of countries, but the US is the most extreme case, has changed a lot over the past few decades. And in particular, in the US, you can see a big part of this is the fact that people who used to be paid $500,000 now are paid $2 million, and people who used to be paid $1 million are now paid $10 million. And so I think it will be a bit naive to believe that this evolution is simply the consequence of higher skills, higher productivity, and I think we have tried with my colleagues and Emmanuel Saez in particular to put together a very large data set with all publicly traded corporations in North America, Europe, Japan, trying to compare the companies paying their top managers 10 million rather than 1 million, and trying to see whether there was this had something to do with the performance, the job creation of the managers, and I'm sorry to tell you that we could not find really the relation with performance. I think in many cases this has more to do with the ability of top managers, to influence the pay determination process, to sometimes to put the right people in the right compensation committee, and it will be very naive to believe that the labor market at the very top end, works exactly as in the textbook economic model with perfect information where we know the productivity of everyone. This is a very theoretical model, and I think in the real world, in a very large corporation, it's very difficult to know, what's the productivity of, the chief financial officer when you have 10,000 employees. What will be the output of the company with a different chief financial officer? Who knows? So given the huge imperfect information, of course, the people who are in power will tend to influence the process in their favor. And maybe what has happened, in particular in the US, is that there's been a complete change in the incentive system for top managers, shareholders, and I will show this to you at the end, but as probably many of you know, there's been a huge decline in the progressivity of the income tax system in the US, which used to be the most progressive in the world until the 1970s, and which became one of the least progressive, at least in the Western world, after Reagan. And probably this has contributed to change dramatically the incentives for top managers to try to get a pay increase. So, you always want to be paid 1 million more, but when you have a top tax rate of 70 or 80%, which was the level in the US in the 50s, 60s, you are less motivated and to get this pay increase. And also maybe your shareholders, your subordinates will tell you, well, okay, 70, 80% will go straight to the treasury, so that's not, it's not worth it. Whereas after Reagan, with a tax rate below 30%, you have much more incentive. So anyway, in the book, I think there's all of these explanations have played a role: a skill-based explanation, education, changes in corporate governance. So in the book, I analyze these different processes in different countries. The data we have is still imperfect, so I think we have more data than we used to, but it's very difficult to be sure about exactly the role of each explanation. Let me now move to a different type of data that I put together in the book, which has to do not so much with income inequality, but with wealth inequality, and also with the ratio of wealth to income. Okay? And probably that's the most important part of the book is that I am trying to shift the attention from income inequality to wealth inequality. And I think the two are important, of course, but in the long run, the transformation in the structure of wealth are maybe even more important than rising income inequality. I mean, in the US, of course, people care a lot about this, but I think in Europe and to some extent in Asia, rising income inequality has been less extreme than in the US, and issues of wealth are maybe even more important. So let me show you another graph which looks a little bit like this, but which is in fact very different. So this is the capital income ratio in Europe. Over roughly, so this is over about the same period. Well, it's, the second one is a bit longer, but you can see the same kind of U-shaped pattern, with a decline during the period of World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, and then an increase in the period after that. But in fact, it's a very different curve. It's a very different economic mechanism. So they look a little bit the same, but these are really two different evolutions. And they could come together in the future, but for now, they are different evolutions. So the first evolution was particularly strong in the US and less strong in Europe and Japan. This evolution is particularly strong in Europe and Japan, but less strong in the US. So what is this evolution? So this is the ratio of capital to income. So in my book, capital is used as a synonymous for wealth, and this includes all the capital assets that private individuals on this graph or the government can own. And I will show you government wealth or capital in a minute, but for now, this is aggregate private wealth. So this is the sum of real estate assets, business assets, financial assets, minus financial liability, minus debt. Okay? So in the book, of course, I also describe separately the evolution of real estate, business, land, because all these different forms of capital have a different history, different mechanism. I will come back later on the importance in the movement of real estate prices, which is an issue that maybe is important in Taiwan, like in other countries. But it's also useful sometimes to make the big addition, taking the market values of the different assets and see what's the aggregate value of wealth and compute the ratio with national income. So this is what I do on this graph. So until World War I, you have a ratio between 600 and 700%, which means that aggregate private household wealth is between 6 and 7 years of national income. So it's almost like 6-7 years of GDP. The national income is the GDP minus capital depreciation plus net foreign income. So that's of the order of 90% of national income is of the order of 90% of GDP. So if you were to divide by GDP, you will have basically the same graph, but the level will be slightly different because it's 90% of the other. The very high level of capital to income until World War I corresponds to a situation where what I call in the book a patrimonial society, which is not necessarily negative. The fact that we have a lot of capital is certainly not bad. And as you can see, the reason why you have this very strong evolution is due to a large part to very tragic reason, which is first, you had a lot of capital destruction during World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. So that's part of the explanation. The other reason for the big decline between 1910 and 1950 is the fact that during this time period, European private saving was used not to invest, but to pay for the war. And so a big part of the private saving was used to buy public debt. And the public debt itself was used to pay for the war, to destroy the rest of the capital stock. So, it's a very sad story, but this is the story of Europe and of other parts of the world as well. But in Europe, this was particularly strong. In Japan, you have an evolution that's very similar, although we don't have the full historical series. I will show you Japan for the recent period in a minute, and you will see that it's very similar. And finally, this is partly induced by policy. Well, war, if you want, is a kind of policy, but very extreme. It was also induced in 1950 by more peaceful policy, including nationalization, rent control. This contributed to lower value of private wealth to GDP. So at the end of the day, this combination of destruction, inflation to destroy the public debt, nationalization, rent control, everything contributed to a much lower level of capital to income in 1950, 1960. And then you have this long process of recovery, which, continues until today, in a way. So, here I show you decennial averages, so everything seems very smooth. I will show you a figure with annual series. With annual series, it's not as smooth, as you will see, because, putting a price on capital is always complicated. So real estate prices, stock market prices vary enormously from year to year. But it's important to see that this year-to-year variation takes place within a long-term evolution, which is pretty clear as well. So there are several lessons that you can draw from this graph. Okay, the first basic lesson is that clearly the capital income ratio is not a constant over time. And so sometimes, in economic textbook, you read that the capital to income or capital to output ratio is a constant. So, you should be careful with economic textbook. Sometimes in a textbook, when we don't know much about something, we just assume it's a constant, which makes things simpler. And of course, if you have only one data point, everything is a constant. But when you have more longer historical series, you can see that this is not at all a constant. And in fact, there is no reason why it should be a constant. If you take our standard model of economic growth with capital labor substitution, any ratio of capital output can be an equilibrium. It all depends on how much you save and invest as compared to how fast you grow. And in particular, the population growth, the growth rate of productivity, and depending on, saving investment rate on the one hand and population and productivity growth rate on the other hand, you can get to very different ratios. This is a very standard economic growth model of Solow. And we should not be surprised that you can have all these variations. So this is the first observation. Second observation, there's nothing bad, of course, in having a high capital income ratio. Sometimes I see interpretation of my book, in a very apocalyptic way, saying this is bad, we have more and more capital. But, it's good to have more capital. I like capital. I like it so much that I would like more people to access capital ownership. And so the problem is inequality in capital ownership. But the fact that we have a higher total quantity of capital relative to income, it's not necessarily bad at all. And the fact that everything had been destroyed in 1950 was certainly not particularly good. So this graph, I should be very clear that this is not a graph about inequality. You could have this graph in a perfectly egalitarian society where because of land reform like in Taiwan, or because everybody has an equal share in real estate, or because everybody has an equal share in the stock market through a gigantic pension fund, you could still have an increase in the capital income ratio in a perfectly egalitarian society where everybody has an equal share in the national capital stock. So there is nothing in this graph about inequality, and there is nothing bad in this evolution. Except that in practice, the property of capital is not at all egalitarian. And the concentration of capital ownership is always a lot larger than the concentration of income. So, for income, I have shown you, the typical numbers is that the share going to the top 10% vary between 1/3 and 1/2. Well, for capital ownership, for wealth, it varies between, say, 50% to 90%. So, even the most egalitarian society in terms of wealth, if you take Sweden in the 1980s, you have between 50 and 60% of total wealth belonging to the top 10%. And if you take Sweden a century ago, or France in 1914, or Britain in 1914, you had 90% of total wealth belonging to the top 10%. So wealth is a bit less unequal today than it used to be a century ago. Well, actually, substantially less unequal. You have 60 or to 70% in the US belonging to the top 10 as opposed to 90% a century ago. So, you have 20 to 30% that now belongs to the middle class, which in the book I define as the middle 40% between the top 10 and the bottom 50. But still, wealth is very unequal. In particular, much more unequally distributed than the distribution of labor income. So when you have a higher ratio of wealth to income, and when you have a higher capital share in national income, then everything else equals, it tends to increase inequality. But it could be different. There's no reason why a higher ratio of capital to income or a higher capital share should lead to a rise in inequality. It all depends on how the distribution of property is changing. Okay? So in the book, I try carefully to explore these different dimensions of inequality, inequality of labor income, inequality of capital income, and ratio of wealth to income. And these three different dimensions, and of course also the correlation between who has high labor income, who has high capital income, which is always a positive correlation, but always less than one. All these dimensions matter, and all these dimensions refer to different set of policies and institutions, and there's always more than one solution. So in this presentation, in the rest of this presentation, I will focus on the following 3 points, although probably mostly on the first two. First point, I have already started to talk about it. This is about the return of what I call a patrimonial or wealth-based society, and that's particularly strong in Europe and Japan, where wealth and income ratio seem to be returning to very high levels that we had before World War I. And the basic intuition is that in Europe and Japan, we have particularly small population growth as compared to the US. So the per capita GDP growth are not that different, but the population growth is zero in Europe and Japan, or sometimes even slightly negative, whereas in the US, it's still close to 1% per year. So this makes a big difference in terms of total growth rate. And for a given level of saving, you tend to, in a slow growth society, wealth accumulated in the past naturally become very important. And that's partly due to aging. You also tend actually to save more in these countries with lower population growth than in the US. And, in the very long run, this can become very relevant for the entire world. And I think this is already relevant for a number of countries in Asia and maybe in Taiwan, although I have not seen estimates of the national wealth to national income ratio in Taiwan. Every data I have seen for Korea and certainly, of course, Japan, and points in the direction that there's been this kind of increase in capital income ratio. And as I said, this is not necessarily bad. It all depends on the inequality of capital ownership, but this changes certainly our approach to a number of issues, and in particular in terms of regulation of capital, in terms of taxation of capital. When you have a much higher ratio of private wealth to GDP, maybe it will make sense to tax labor income probably a bit less and wealth a bit more. But I think this has consequences for our view of a number of policy issues. But ultimately, it really depends a lot on the inequality in capital ownership. So that's why my second point will be on the future of wealth concentration, wealth inequality. And I will argue that an important force is the gap between R and G, between the net of tax rate of return and the growth rate. So it is only at this stage, that this R minus G plays a role. It doesn't play much of a role to explain the rise in US income inequality, which had a lot to do with education, corporate governance. This doesn't play a role to explain the rise of wealth income ratio. This might play a big role for the future of wealth inequality. Let me make very clear that the fact that R is bigger than G does not imply that we go to infinite inequality, because you always have some mobility. You always have some people, some families will go down, some families will go up. So you always have some level of mobility, but for a bigger gap between R and G, you tend to go to some equilibrium level of inequality that is higher. Okay, so it's not that inequality goes to infinity, but just that the equilibrium level of inequality in the wealth distribution is rising with the gap between R and G. And during most of human history, of course, R minus G was very large for a simple reason, which is that the growth rate was zero. So, sometimes people are surprised that R can be bigger than G forever, but in fact, let me be very clear about the fact that this is what you have in every theoretical model of economic growth. R is always bigger than G in the long run, and this is what we've always had during human history, simply because the growth rate was 0%, until the Industrial Revolution, and the rate of return to capital, of course, was not 0%. The rate of return on land in most agrarian societies was typically 5%. If you read any novel by Jane Austen or any 18th century novel, you will see that if you want an annual income of £1,000, you should have a capital value of 20,000 pounds, so that 5% of 20,000 gives you 1,000. And it was so obvious to everybody that the novelist would not even need to explain it. And in the same paragraph, they will go from the annual income to the capital value, back to the capital and annual income all the time without explaining to the reader, because this was, in a way, this was the very foundation of society. This is what allowed a group of owners to live off their wealth and to do something else in life than to care about their own survival. And so inequality was not rising indefinitely because, of course, the owners of capital were consuming the return to the property. This is what property was here for. So R bigger than G just means that you can consume part of the return. So if G equal 1% and R equal 5%, you can consume 4/5 of the return. You only need to reinvest 1/5 in order to ensure that your wealth rises as fast as the size of the economy. So R bigger than G, there's nothing evil about that. This is the very least you can ask from capital ownership, that it allows to produce higher return than what you need to reinvest. Otherwise, what's the point of having capital? That will be really, if R was smaller than G, this will be what economists call dynamic inefficiency, because you will need to reinvest each year more than the return of the capital just to make sure that your capital keeps in line with the size of the economy. This will really mean that you have too much capital. You should eat some of it and have less capital. So R bigger than G, there's nothing surprising or there's nothing evil about that. It is just that a bigger gap between R and G tends to amplify initial inequalities of wealth and tend to lead to a level of concentration of wealth that is higher. And this effect can be quantitatively quite powerful. So in the 20th century, of course, this balance between R and G was very deeply affected by the huge capital shocks of the World War I, World War II, which reduced net of tax, net of capital destruction, rate of return to very low levels, sometimes negative. And the post-war growth rate were extremely large, in Europe and Japan because of the reconstruction. And the growth rate, of course, in some countries, including Taiwan, are still very high. But as we all know, you don't have growth rate of 5 or 10% per year forever. And even in Taiwan, I think it's already below that, like 3% or 4%, I don't know. And we know that as countries catch up with the richer countries, the growth rate of productivity in the long run are maybe closer to 1 to 2% per year, certainly not 5% per year. So, it's only due to very unusual shocks in the 20th century and the balance between R and G was affected. But in the future, in the 21st century, the net of tax rate of return, in particular due to international competition between countries to attract capital, might rise because of a decline in capital taxation. The growth rate might decline, in particular because of population growth going to zero. And this could lead to higher inequality in the long run, and I will talk more about this. So before I move into these 2 points, maybe let me say a few words about what we can say about inequality in China as compared to this European, US, Japan pattern. And, I just come back from China, so I've discussed a lot these topics with Chinese economists and businessmen and journalists and politicians and other people. The simple thing that we can say is that we don't really know. It's very difficult to compare the measures we have of distribution in China with other countries. There is a lot of evidence that inequality has increased in China in the past 15 years or 20 years, of course. Certainly, as compared to the 80s, before the reform, it has increased a lot, and that's not necessarily bad. If you want development, you want some level of inequality. The question is, when does it become excessive? So in China, many people believe now that maybe it has become excessive, or at least, the increase in the past 15 years has become really substantial. What can we say about the comparison? It's very difficult because, as I said earlier, one problem in China, you have an income tax, but you don't have income tax statistics. So, you don't know at all how the number of taxpayers by income brackets is changing year after year. And this is one of the only countries I know where the government does not publish income tax statistics at all. And so you have to use household survey. Household survey are a very useful research tool to analyze distribution, but they raise serious problem in particular for the top of the distribution because typically this underestimates inequality quite substantially. And for the US, if we didn't have the income tax data, we could not have seen this very large increase as clearly in inequality. The household survey, minimizes the top incomes, not only in China, but in the US everywhere. So that's a problem. For wealth income ratio, there seems to be a rise in China due in particular to very strong rise in real estate price, but with a much bigger share of public capital in national wealth. So there are some preliminary national balance sheet for China, which are now available and suggest a share of 30-40% for public capital. So that's certainly a very significant difference with Europe, US, Japan, where the share of public capital is very close to 0% or even negative in some countries, as I will show you, when public debt is bigger than public assets. So I'd be very interested to see how Taiwan can be compared to this kind of estimates on public and private capital, and probably some people in the room or in the panel know much more than I do about this, and I'd be very happy to learn more. Regarding wealth inequality, some estimates suggest that it has gone up quite strongly in China, going maybe from a European to an American level, say from 60% to 70-75% for the top 10% wealth share. But let me say that these estimates come from surveys that have been corrected for the top part of the distribution. They are not really comparable over time. They are not really comparable with other countries. I think China, like other countries, but maybe even more than other countries, would need more transparency about income and wealth inequality. So there is a progressive income tax, but with no income tax statistics. There is no real system of tax on wealth, property. There is no tax on inheritance at all. So when you don't have a tax on inheritance, you have much less information about inherited wealth and the distribution of wealth by wealth brackets. And, I think it will be very useful, for China to publish detailed tabulations by income brackets, to introduce an inheritance tax and publish corresponding information. You cannot fight corruption simply on a case-by-case basis, just by putting a few people in jail, from time to time. I think a more systematic approach based on more transparency on income and wealth and more data on income inequality, wealth inequality, I think will be useful. So let me return to the evolution of private capital. So remember, so this is the same ratio between capital and income that I have already shown you before. So this is the annual graph. So, I have shown you before the evolution in the very long run with decennial averages. And now I am going to zoom on the later part, 1970, 2010 period. And I am going to look at more countries and with annual series. So let me return to this, if I can. Yes. So this is 1970 to 2010. And now these are annual series instead of decennial averages. So you can see all the big year-to-year fluctuation. You can also see that even though you have big year-to-year fluctuations, there is a general trend. Okay, so here you have all, these are the biggest developed countries in the world, US, Japan, Germany, France, UK, Italy, Canada, Australia. You can see that every country was between 2 and 3 years of national income in private wealth in 1970, and now all countries are between 4 and 7 years. So clearly there is a general upward trend. As I said before, this is not necessarily bad. This reflects to some extent, aging of the population, lower population growth, more accumulated wealth. That's a general evolution. That's particularly strong in Europe and Japan. So one explanation, I already gave it, is the slowdown of growth and the fact that you tend to accumulate higher wealth relative to national income or GDP when you have a lower growth. Now, this is not the only explanation. There is really a whole set of factors that contribute to this evolution. Another important explanation is the increase in real estate price. And, I think that can be very relevant, of course, for Taiwan as well. And this has been important in Korea. This has been very important in China. Pretty much everywhere, the rise in real estate price contributes a lot to the rise of total private wealth to GDP ratio. You can see that in Japan between 1985 and 1990, where they go from 5 years to 7 years of national income and wealth, which could not happen simply because of the accumulation of saving. You cannot get rich so fast just by saving. Even with a Japanese saving rate, that's not enough. You cannot accumulate 2 years of national income in just 4 years between 1985 and 1989. This will require a net of depreciation saving rate of 50%, which no country does. Even China at the highest point of maybe 45%, but that's including depreciation. Net of depreciation, it will be maybe 30%. So this very big increase is due to the real estate price boom and also stock market price boom. And then in the 1990s, the asset prices in Japan go down. And you have different, chronology of asset price boom in different countries. And this plays an important role. The difficulty is that you also have sometimes this creates problem of financial regulation. So for instance, I have not shown you on the graph the case of Spain, but Spain in 2007 was above the graph, between 800 and 900%. But at the time, the European Central Bank, didn't have that kind of data. And I think this would have been useful, in order to calm down the process in the banking sector in Spain with the real estate bubble to have that kind of data. It's important to realize that this comes from national balance sheets that are now constructed in most countries, but this is something that did not exist just 5 years ago for many countries. So, national accounts make progress. They are still imperfect, but now in many countries we have national wealth accounts in addition to the national income accounts, and this is what allows to compute this kind of series on private capital, which we then link to much older estimates of national wealth that were already made in the 19th century, at a time when economists were in fact much more interested by national wealth than national income. So in a way we are pursuing this tradition using the modern data. And in order to regulate what banks do and the real estate boom, that can be very, very useful. So another reason for this increase in the private wealth to income ratio, I see that I have 5 minutes, which is exactly what I need. And another explanation for the rise in the private capital to income ratio is the transfer from public to private capital. So as you can see, so here I have put public capital at the bottom of the graph in addition to private capital. So you can see the case of Italy where it is negative in 2010. So what does it mean that it's negative? It means that Italy has more public debt than public assets. Okay, so even if the Italian government was to sell all the public assets, all the schools, all the hospitals, all the public buildings, that will not be enough to repay the public debt. Okay, so this is negative public wealth. Now, in the US or in Japan or in France, in Germany, it's close to zero because the public assets are worth, according to official balance sheets, they are worth around 100% of GDP, and public debt is around 80 or 90% of GDP. So the difference between the two is slightly positive, but only slightly. So of course, private capital is always a lot bigger than public capital, at least in non-communist countries, but it's always good to check that we are not in a communist country, so you can see that these countries have always had a lot more private wealth. Now, in the 1970s, public capital was less than private, but was significant. This was maybe between 1/4 and 1/3 of total capital in some countries through the public sector in some company and sometimes in real estate. Now, over this time period, you have to some extent a transfer from public to private capital because look at Italy, for instance. They have the lowest level of public capital. They have also the highest level of private capital, and this is partly because, of course, Italian households have bought the vast quantity of public debt issued by their government, and they have bought the public assets that were privatized by their government. So if you privatize public assets and you have more public debt, you increase the private wealth, but the national wealth, which is the sum of private and public, does not necessarily increase. Now, in the case of rich countries over this period, you can see that the increase in private capital has been a lot bigger than the decline in public capital. So the national capital has increased, which again is mostly good news. And I think it will be. Well, it's good news, except that when you have negative public capital, maybe that's a bit too low. I'm not saying public capital should be half of national capital or 30 or 40% like in China, but I think 0% or negative is maybe a bit too small. We can talk more about that later. Let me speed up and give you an example about an extreme example of R minus G and inequality, increase in inequality in wealth. So far, I didn't talk too much about inequality. I talked about total private wealth, total public wealth. This is data coming from the Forbes billionaire rankings. And you can see, so I start in 1987 because this is when Forbes started publish their ranking of billionaires. And what this table is showing you is that the top wealth holders, as recorded by Forbes, are growing a lot faster than the size of the world economy and that average wealth or average income for the world economy. So this is computed at the global level. So this includes China, all emerging countries. This is for the entire world, and this is looking at the world ranking of billionaires of Forbes. Let me say, very clearly that this is not particularly reliable data. I think it's a bit sad in a way that we have to read magazines in order to know about wealth, and it will be better if we could have, publicly produced statistics, if we could read IMF publication or national statistical publication of Eurostat or in Taiwan or in Japan to learn more about wealth. But the problem is that you wouldn't find the information, and partly because we don't have the kind of automatic transmission system for cross-border financial assets that would allow public statistical institute and international organizations like the IMF to compute that kind of data so that we know better how the world distribution of wealth is changing. So for the time being, we have to do with what we have. And, this is probably a lot more reliable than what we have in household survey, where the top is not very well covered. And this indicates that, the top is rising a lot faster than the average. So, of course, there's a lot of mobility in the wealth distribution, as I said earlier. These are not the same people. You have some people who, the top billionaires I understand that time is up, so I think I have to stop, but maybe I'm going to take 3 minutes just to finish. These are not the same people at the top in 1987, 2013. Of course, the top billionaires in 1987, some in particular, some are from Japan, and everybody has forgotten their name. Whereas in 2013, you have billionaires from Mexico, from all over the place. But the fact that some people from China, from the US, but the fact that some people go down and some people go up, in principle, these two effects should compensate each other. That this does not, you should not have that the average wealth in this group is growing 3 times or 4 times faster than average wealth or income in the world. So this is, this cannot continue forever, of course. If this was to continue forever, the share of world wealth going to billionaire will go to 100%, which will seem, a bit too much, I think, to everybody. So this has to stop somewhere, but we don't really know where this is going to stop, and I think this is, this is a major problem in itself. So let me just conclude by saying that, the most rational regulation to solve this kind of extreme dynamics of inequality, there are many solutions to inequality, education, public property, public debt, but in order to solve the specific problem of concentration of income and wealth at the very top, the most important, the most rational solution will be more transparency about income and wealth so that we can adjust the tax rate that we ask at the different income and wealth group to whatever we observe. Now, the history of taxation, and let me conclude with this graph. You know, the history of taxation in the past, you know, is always full of surprise. So, you know, nobody knows what's going to happen in the coming decades in the 21st century. You know, you can see in the 20th century, so this is the evolution of top income tax rate in 4 countries, and, you know, I could show you more countries and you would have other surprise. 1 century ago, nobody would have guessed that the progressive income tax would ever exist. And then suddenly, you know, in the US and the UK, the top tax rate were 80–90% during many decades. This only applied to very, very high incomes, like above $1 million in annual income, you know, in the US between 1930 and 1980. And probably this is the reason why this did not destroy American capitalism, because, you know, paying managers $10 million rather than one maybe is not so useful. So then you have this big change under Reagan. You have the same evolution for the taxation of inheritance. Okay, so this is for the taxation, the top rate for the taxation of the highest income. If you look at the top rate for the taxation of largest inheritance, you can see that the US and the UK also have gone much further than France and Germany. That's partly because in France and Germany, a lot of the wealth redistribution was done by the capital destruction of the war, you know, which is another way to redistribute wealth. So in the US and the UK, you have much less destruction, but they use the tax system a lot more to redistribute wealth after World War II. So, you know, there are different ways to redistribute wealth. Inflation also can be powerful. I tend to view progressive taxation as, you know, the most civilized form of redistribution as compared to war, inflation, and other forms. You can see that it's possible to organize capitalism in different ways, you know, with different level of tax. You know, all these 4 countries, in spite of all their very different political tradition, have a top tax rate on inheritance, which is around 40% right now. And this has been like that for a century, or, you know, with variation. And, you know, this did not destroy capitalism in the US, in Britain, in France, in Germany. And nobody, you know, Merkel or Cameron, you know, are not proposing to reduce this to 0%. And so, I think it's important to have this kind of historical evidence in mind when we talk about taxation and inequality. These debates have been with us forever. They did not start yesterday. In many countries, sometimes we tend to believe that we are unique and that, you know, we cannot learn from others' experience. And certainly in my country, you know, in France, people believe they are unique. In China, in America, maybe sometime in Taiwan. But you know, in fact, we are not unique. There is always a lot to learn from other countries' experience. There is always more than one solution. And I think looking at this broad perspective on the history and international history of wealth and taxation and inequality can help us find a better solution for the future. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm really sorry for taking more time than I should have. Thank you very much.